Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday the 29th, where I wanted to finish up talking about the syllabus and begin to talk about some of the recommended readings that I had assigned for the class to prepare us for talking about literature and talking about film. And you can see that the notes will always be below all of these videos. So, first is the syllabus. And you'll remember that I had skipped the section on plagiarism, which is basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. It's considered kind of academic theft. And at its worst, you could actually be expelled from the college with a notation indicating that you plagiarized. And I would always give two stories to talk about why you should consider not plagiarizing. The first actually happened to me as an educator very early on in my career, pre-internet, where I'm reading a set of papers and I realize something sounds familiar. And since it's pre-internet, I can't go on the internet to look for the original source, because as many sources as exist to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sources to help professors determine if students are plagiarizing. But I quickly realized where I had recognized that passage from. It was our own college textbook that I had assigned for class. And there were a few mechanical mistakes in there. I don't know if the person was a sloppy plagiarist or if they were hopeful that if I saw a few errors, I would think it was their original work. The better story happened around the same time, not to me, but to a middle-aged professor. That part's important. And it was in all the academic newspapers, because there are such things as academic newspapers, where a professor is reading a set of papers, and again, he realizes that something sounds familiar. And it didn't take him long to determine that the reason why it sounded familiar was not because he had read it before. He himself had written it decades earlier as an undergraduate. It was one of his old papers. And again, what is the likelihood? 1 in a million. It had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers. So those two stories worked well for their time. Of course, now we have artificial intelligence, and it's a brave new world out there. And I say all of this to encourage you not to use artificial intelligence, at least in this class. Not that I'm averse to artificial intelligence. And I wanted to explain why. First of all, I've deliberately constructed this class so that you can be rewarded for effort, for instance, your participation grade, as well as for product. And I've also structured this class that you could do a revision of the first paper so that you could improve your grade. Secondly, I do have some concerns about artificial intelligence. The speed of it, these sorts of changes should be occurring over decades, not days, as we're seeing. I wonder what the economic impact and the sociological impact will be. Certainly, from an economic perspective, entire industries could be wiped out, and I don't know what the consequences of that would be. I also have concerns. If you are a science fiction viewer, you know that once the technology can no longer be controlled by the human, bad things usually happen. So I have concerns about that. I also have concerns about the accuracy of artificial intelligence. You may have heard or read that it has a tendency to, for lack of a better word, hallucinate, or at least that's the language that the technological experts are using, so that it's not necessarily producing accurate information. So you put all of those together, and I suggest that, at least for a class like this one, it would be best to just sort of rely on your own efforts. I guess it sounds a little bit corny, but the idea of learning on your own is the intent of this particular class, not necessarily having to rely on artificial intelligence. You can rely on natural intelligence, which is your own. So that's my little speech about plagiarism. And you can see in the notes below how I have scheduled several readings from the textbook, and the page numbers are included for the edition that is listed on the textbook, or in the syllabus, I should say. But you can use any edition. Your page numbers might be different. And I had indicated that I'm well aware that you may not necessarily have had an opportunity to do these readings, which is why I'm filling you in. These are not the pieces of literature or cinema themselves. This is more introductory material. And the first section about reading imaginative literature is about how it's really difficult to put a neat and tidy definition on literature. Shall I suggest even impossible? That I suppose, in the broadest sense of the word, it's anything that's written, but that ultimately when we talk about literature, we're not talking about a newspaper article, or we're not talking about, let's say, an instruction manual for a piece of for a piece of electronics. What we're talking about is storytelling, creative writing. And the idea behind good literature, and again, evaluation can be subjective, but that literature that's worth academic study in an academic classroom, is that it helps to broaden our perspectives. And yes, it's meant to entertain, but it also probably provides social commentary and uses language in interesting ways. Um, there is an article that I have posted below in the first section about your brain on fiction, which talks about actually some scientific studies that have been done on MRI scans of individuals as they were reading. And what they found is that reading is a very close replica to actually experiencing an event. It's probably the closest we're ever going to get outside of actually experiencing that event. So if you've ever experienced the situation where it feels like you are forgetting that you're reading, that you're actually involved in the story, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is fascinating, I think, because it means that through reading, through literature, we can experience viewpoints and perspectives and have experiences that we never could in our day-to-day life. Think about what this would mean for something like interpersonal skills, in that we would be able to basically learn about other individuals, including their thoughts, which you don't when you're interacting live, but when you are reading, you oftentimes are reading about character thoughts. And it also means that literature serves a useful function outside of just entertainment. So I encourage you to read the article from the New York Times, where basically it's only a couple pages long. And it basically talks a little bit about the studies that were done internationally. I like that in particular. So it wasn't necessarily culturally specific. And they kept finding the same results over and over again. For instance, the reading of a word that's associated with scent, like perfume, would activate the element in your brain, or the area, I should say, in your brain that's responsible for scent. So, at least in terms of your brain, it's not making a huge distinction between actually smelling something and reading about smelling something. So, in terms of literature, there is subjectivity involved with it in terms of those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study. There's a term for this, it's called canon. Those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study. And those are usually those great texts that you usually hear about, that, yes, we're going to be reading Shakespeare, for instance, or, yes, we're going to be reading Emily Dickinson, because those are part of the canon. You might have heard of Moby Dick, which is usually considered to be part of the canon. And I can tell you that when Moby Dick came out, it wasn't necessarily even considered a piece of literature. It was considered a study of whales. And it was only upon reflection later that it was considered to be a great piece of literature. And who makes these determinations? Who are these scholars, these critics, these teachers? And usually they have a background in literature, obviously, or else they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. And there is also something called the test of time, that one generation teaches the next generation of scholars and critics so that they know these names, like Frost and Hemingway and Shakespeare. And then those new scholars and critics teach their new generation of scholars and critics. The question of canon is also political, because many times those scholars or critics or teachers come from a particular gender or a particular ethnicity or a particular age, and oftentimes that's reflected in the choices that they make about those works that are considered to be great. So the canon has come under great scrutiny in the last few decades, especially as school systems and students in school systems have become more diverse. That where is my voice and where is my viewpoint? And that's led to an examination of the canon. Do we stay with the old traditional works of the canon? Do we change the canon to reflect more contemporary viewpoints? Do we blend the two? And if we do, that means an expansion of the reading list. So that means a lot more reading. Usually what you see is an attempt to try to blend. Certainly that's what I'm going to be trying to do within the context of this class. If nothing else, oftentimes what we read is text that is written by somebody who is long dead. So the question of where are the voices of my time included in this canon? And certainly you can find canon in other classes as well. History, those elements that you do likely study. And it's a fascinating experiment to see how history is taught in other cultures, because other cultures give very different perspectives of history. So that said, when we are talking about how to read literature from an academic perspective, so that those scholars and critics and teachers are making decisions about canon, there are ways for going about reading formally, which is the second section of the notes below. Critical strategies for reading. And I just wanted to briefly review some of the different schools. It's almost like medicine or law, where you've got generalists, but then you've also got specialists. And the reading and writing about literature, the critique of literature, has become a profession, much like law or much like medicine. Usually you find these individuals at the university level. That's the difference between the university and college, by the way. At the college level, the focus for professors is teaching and research is secondary. It's the exact opposite at the university level, where the focus for professors is on research and teaching is secondary. So, as I had indicated, you can find these readings in the textbook, and I put the textbook on reserve in the GCC library. I'm going to talk about them briefly, but certainly you will do yourself a favor if you do these readings, because it'll probably make a lot more sense what I'm talking about in terms of my summary of some of the major points. And I admit the readings are a little bit dry, but remember, we still haven't gotten to the point yet where we are actually reading literature or watching cinema. So these techniques can be used for cinema just like they can be used for written literature. So I guess it all started in the early 1900s, of turning literary analysis into a kind of academic discipline. Um, and to do it formally, and they call themselves formalists. They looked at the formal elements of a work, the language, the structure, the tone, and the assumption was that you had to have a certain amount of schooling in order to understand what those elements were and how to evaluate them. And then we fast forward a few decades. This gets us into about the 1940s to the 1960s. It also coincided with a very challenging job market, and I suspect that that's one of the reasons why there were the new critics, as they called themselves, to try to find jobs in the profession of literary analysis. They wanted to do something new or different. I think the term they chose to call themselves is rather weak, new critics, because what is new at one moment becomes old in another. But nevertheless, the new critics focused on the close reading of a text itself, that you didn't have to have any kind of background and language or structure or tone, that anybody could engage in a piece of reading and begin to analyze. Now, obviously, the more education you've got and the more experience you have is going to mean that you're going to have a more sophisticated reading. But anybody, whether they be um, 7 or 17 should be able to begin to approach a poem, as long as they understand the meaning of the words, that is. And this is very popular in school systems because it means that you can expose students to literature at very young levels. And of course, you expect more as the levels increase, but you can look at things like diction, which is how you use language, or irony, which is the exact opposite of what you expect, but with a twist. The firehouse burning down, for instance, is the exact opposite of what you would expect with a twist, which is an example that's given in our textbook. Paradox, two seemingly contradictory terms that actually really support one another. Symbolism, and that happens very frequently in literature. Literature is oftentimes representational, where an author will use a symbol to represent something, oftentimes something concrete to represent something that's not concrete. So, for instance, think about something that's concrete like a flag that's used to represent something that's not concrete, like patriotism. And this is not something that we were born knowing. This is something that we were taught, that this symbol would represent that element. Authors will oftentimes use symbols that aren't necessarily that obvious, so we're going to have to figure them out. Metaphor, where you're comparing two dissimilar things. You're not using like or as in this instance. If you're using like or as, then that happens to be a simile and not a metaphor. So you can use all of these techniques. You can use the sounds of language, rhyme, for instance, the endings of words having similar sounds, alliteration, the beginnings of words having similar sounds, in order to give the writing a musicality to it. And of course, there are things like plot, which is the most surface level, but perhaps it is the most important in the sense that if you don't know what the plot is, you can't do any of the other elements. So you need to know what's happening. And I usually recommend 3 readings or 3 viewings of a film. The first, just to get the plot, what's happening. The second, for analysis. And the third, as review before you begin to do some writing or some in-depth discussion. Characterization, who are the characters, how are they presented? Narration, who's telling you the story? Much like in real life, when you get information, you're not just evaluating the information, but who's giving you that information. And if somebody else was giving you that information, that might change your perception of the story. So these new critics sort of branched off into very specific specialties. And luckily, they oftentimes chose terms that would indicate what they were specializing in. So biographical critics focused on biography, specifically the biography of the author's life, so that knowing something about the author would help inform your understanding of the work. Makes sense. However, that can also be limiting because literature is creative. It's about fiction. And an author might not necessarily be writing or creating a film about something that reflects their own biographical experiences. And we may not necessarily even know much about the author's biography, or we might be wrong about the author's biography. Psychological critics look at mental states, whether it's the mental state of the author, so what encouraged them to create their piece of art, or perhaps the mental states of the characters themselves. You could kind of play armchair psychologist and analyze those characters. Or how about analyzing the emotional state of us, the reader, and how that influences how we respond to a particular work. Historical critics look at the past events of the time, the history, and how that might have influenced a work. Makes sense. If you want to understand Shakespeare, you need to know about the history of the time period. But again, this can be very time consuming. And of course, if we are not getting correct history, because we know that history is oftentimes told by the victor, that can also influence negatively our interpretation. Marxist critics, any of you are studying economics, you might have heard of Karl Marx and about socioeconomics, and that everything in one way or another is based on money systems and capitalistic systems. And that said, and his critique of capitalistic systems. So That might be a little bit different than the new historicists. Notice there were the historical critics that were talking about history. And now the new historicists, and I wish again they hadn't used the term new, because what was new at the time is not necessarily new in the future. They weren't focused just on the typical history of dates and wars and politics. They were focused specifically on culture. And the broadest sense of the word is culture is any group membership, but we usually talk about popular culture, those things that large groups of people consume, whether it be music, or whether it be video, or it be television, or some combination thereof. I teach classes in media and popular culture, and I think you can learn a great deal about a society, about their cultural preferences. In fact, there have been some cultural critics that have argued that if you really want to understand a people, you don't want to know about their politics or their religion or about their education. You really want to know what kind of food they're eating, what kind of clothes they're wearing, what kind of music they're listening to, because that really gives you a sense of what they value and who they are. So the new historicist critics would focus on things like popular culture. Gender critics would focus just on that, gender. Perhaps they would focus on just the female, or perhaps just the male, or non-binary. Mythological critics would focus on, well, it makes sense, mythology. These old stories that are told over and over again from generation to generation. These traditional legendary stories. For instance, every culture has a story about resurrection. The details are different, but every culture has a story about resurrection. What does that mean about us as humans? Or reader response, which is actually very interesting, I think. Students tend to like this, that the power is not with the author, the power is with the reader. The reader determines the meaning, not the author. Now, that said, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that a reader can just decide, I think the text means this because I want it to mean this, or I think this movie means this because I want it to mean this. You still have to have evidence from the text to support your position. But if you've got a group of readers who can come to some sort of conclusion and come to that conclusion through using evidence that at least is possible, doesn't even have to be probable, just possible, then that's valid, even if the author completely disagrees. Something that we'll revisit actually when the semester progresses with one of the works we'll be doing, though I don't want to give away too many spoilers. And I'm going to end with deconstruction critics. There are lots of other critics, but these are usually the big movements. The deconstruction critics have fallen out of favor, but they were very, very hot in the 1980s or so. And if you know what the word deconstruction means, to take apart, this is what they were doing, but they were doing more than just taking apart a text. They were taking apart its meaning so that it would mean nothing. So how do you do this? You look for contradiction. And every contradiction would basically be another piece of evidence about a lack of meaning. Almost like adding a positive and a negative number where you get a zero. It's actually a philosophical theory that was adapted for literature. And there will be actually a short story that we'll be reading that lends itself very nicely to deconstruction. Again, I won't give any spoilers at this point. The thing with deconstruction, and I think the reason why I fell out of favor, is because deconstruction assumes that there is meaning in the argument that there is no meaning, if that makes any kind of sense. So once individuals began to contemplate that, deconstruction became a lot less popular, but it still exists. So if I were to move on to the third section about reading fiction, where the textbook talks about careful, deliberate reading. As I had indicated, rereading. Reading a text 3 times or watching a movie 3 times. Annotating, taking notes. Whether you do it in the text or you do it in on a pad of paper or you do it on a computer screen or some combination thereof. Journaling is a nice technique where actually you are writing almost like a diary about what you've experienced, but rather than in a diary when you write about your personal experiences, you're writing about that particular text that you're seeing. What you will find, again, one of the advantages to having the textbook is that it will oftentimes provide questions at the ending of a text that we will be reading, and these can help guide you as to what's important. Many of these questions are questions that I myself will pursue as the semester progresses. And in fact, they give you an example of taking notes, and there are lots of different ways to take notes. There's no one particular way. This is for a story that's very short. It's called Story of an Hour. It's on page 15 of the edition that I had ordered. And in fact, we're going to revisit this piece next week. Not from a taking notes perspective, which is how we're dealing with it now, but from an analytic perspective. In other words, trying to understand what's happening in that particular piece. So the text will give you examples of how to annotate. In other words, take notes in the textbook. You might have noticed that many of your paper copy textbooks have large margins, and you are paying for that empty space. Those margins are there for you to insert notes. And also, they will give you examples of how you could write a journal. Not that there's any specific way to write a diary entry or a journal. That said, I wanted to also talk about reading film because this is a literature and film class. And here I will direct you to our syllabus and other documents folder at the top of our Moodle page. This is under the general section. And we have a handout that if we were meeting face to face, I would distribute this handout now, but instead I'm going to talk about it. And again, as I had recommended, I believe it makes more sense for you to take hard copies of all of the electronic copies in the syllabus and other documents folder, just so that you have easy access to them. But in terms of reviewing some of the major points about reading a film, because you can read a film much like you can read a piece of literature, that literature and film, movies, they both utilize storytelling. But in movies, it's the pictures that tell the story. Notice we say we watch a film. We don't say that we hear a film. And in literature, the words tell the story. And, you know, the two words, film and movies, they're synonyms for one another. But film usually has a more advanced connotation. It sounds more sophisticated, more academic, as opposed to movies, which seems more like popular culture. But both are synonyms, in effect, when you are basically documenting a story on celluloid, which is the film stock we would have used before we went digital. And we're probably more likely to watch movies than we are to read books. It's easier because you don't have to imagine what you would imagine when you're reading. Everything is given to you. Film is really the only literary form where the text moves. And it also has a sense of permanence. Unlike live drama, if you were to see something on stage, the story moves. But once it happens, it's gone. Film preserves it forever. And films are all about motion. After all, we call them motion pictures. And they show us many things rather than oftentimes telling us very many things. This is what literature aspires to do, to show rather than tell. If something is shown in a film, it's probably important. Not always, though. Sometimes it could be used as deception to mislead the audience. Alfred Hitchcock, the very famous director, oftentimes did this, and there was even a term for his doing this. It was called the MacGuffin, a deliberate misdirection. And film images offer suggestion, extended meaning, just like symbols offer extension or suggestion and extended meaning. The thing about film is that we've got a camera, so it's more than just an author. There are lots of other people at play. We've got the cinematographer, we've got the director, we've got the producer, we've got the actor. So all of those people, all of those elements are going to influence our experience of the film and our interpretation of it. And ultimately, the camera is doing the thinking for us. The camera shows us what the director and the camera operator want us to see or want us not to see. And the director is ultimately usually responsible for the film. And think about in our time how we tend to deify directors. Spielberg, for instance. And usually not the actor unless they're one of those AA list actors. Maybe this is why actors oftentimes say they want to be directors, is because this is where the real control is. The actors are basically doing what they're told to do. And unlike watching a drama on stage, that yes, that the stage is going to basically show us a moving image, but we get to decide where to focus our attention on that moving image. The camera won't allow us to do that. The camera is going to direct our attention. That's going to be very important for when we see films, starting with Citizen Kane, which is our first film. And it's much easier to analyze films now than in the past because we just didn't have home access. We didn't have the technology that we do now. Started with VCRs, believe it or not. I first experienced film at home through VCR, and then DVD, and now, of course, streaming. So you can watch a film, you can fast forward, you can rewind, and you can have multiple viewings very easily. And just like literature, film can be classified by a genre or category. So if you've got Netflix, you're very familiar with this. They will put films into categories. And sometimes a film will straddle multiple categories. So it could be considered, let's say, both science fiction and horror, as Frankenstein oftentimes is. One thing about film, though, it's not so easy to show the internal mental states of a character. It's easier in literature when you're writing because you can write about what a character thinks. In film, you're going to have to do a voiceover, or perhaps you're going to have a character state what their thoughts are. And when we talk about movie magic, there is a certain element of illusion and magic associated with film, which we usually think of as special effects, but it doesn't necessarily need to be limited to special effects. So what can you expect when you're watching the average film or the average movie? Expect basically 3 acts for the average movie. Act 1 is about a half hour or so, and it introduces us to characters. Act 2, about a half hour to 60 minutes. This is where we get our conflict. And there needs to be some sort of conflict, some sort of tension to make it an interesting story. And then Act 3, the last 30 minutes, is usually where we're going to get resolution. And some film terms, just because I covered some literature terms as well. A frame is a single shot. It's basically a series of pictures that are just shown rapidly one after another. In fact, 24 frames, 24 shots are in a second of film. And that gives us movement, and that tells us story. And scenes are basically series of frames that tell a story. And sequences are multiple scenes that tell a story. So when you are watching cinema, think about things like choreography, movement, because that's all determined ahead of time. Cinematography, the filming. Sound, the audio. Things like how do you frame the scene? How do you shoot the scene? What's going to be in the image and what's not going to be in the image? Are you going to cut from one scene to another? Are you going to fade from one scene to another? Are you going to dissolve from one scene to another? And why or why not? What camera angles are we being given? What lighting are we being given? Lighting can tell a story, very much so. Distances, in terms of filming, medium shots usually provide the most information as compared to the close-up, the focus, usually on a face where you're focusing on an element or face, or a long shot where it's too far to focus on any elements. In fact, we'll talk more about this kind of cinematic language when we talk about Citizen Kane. And some other terms to consider: dollying, when you run a camera back and forth, which gives you one kind of sense in the film, or zooming when you're moving closer or farther away. Panning, this is a stationary camera that's moving side by side. And sound is more than just dialogue, by the way. It's special effects and musical score. So you think about the early days of films, they were silenced, so we didn't have sound. That was a very different kind of experience. And of course, film started as black and white, and with technological advances, we've got color. And while at first there was no choice, now sometimes you'll have directors deliberately film in black and white because it oftentimes establishes a kind of mood. It can suggest something like distance or nostalgia. Just think about award ceremonies, things like the Academy Awards, and how many categories there are. It gives you an idea how many people are involved in giving us the story in cinema. It's much more than just an author when we are reading literature. So this gives you a little bit of a background of what it is that we are discussing in terms of reading a film. And our next class, what we're going to be talking about is some of, again, introductory, some of the readings in the textbook, such as how do you write about fiction and how do you write about film. I'll have another handout for you. What the writing process is, how do you go about constructing a paper, and we'll talk a little bit more about glossaries and literary terms. So, since we talked about canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study, that's our attendance question for our discussion forum today. That'll be due on Friday the 31st, but certainly if you need an extension, ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. What do you think? And again, I'm asking for your personal opinion. What do you think makes a piece of literature or film worthy of being included in the canon? What makes a piece of literature or film worthy of being studied in an academic setting? What makes a piece of literature or film quality? And why? So I'm very curious to read your responses. As you can see, there are no right or wrong answers. I like to ask those kinds of questions with no right or wrong answers because I'm really more interested in your reasoning. So, with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week. You'll remember that you will have a video posted every Monday and Wednesday. So, our next video will be posted by Monday, though my hope is to do it the night beforehand. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.